Kia ora koutou. So as Jess said, my name is Angela, and I chose to do my summer research project on the Chelsea Sugar Factory in Birkenhead. Now, the general history of the factory is well documented. In 1884, it opened its doors with the help of a government bounty offered for the first locally refined sugar. Ever since, it has been working virtually non-stop to produce one of New Zealand's most loved commodities, Chelsea sugar. But less well known than this general history of the factory is the sense of collective anxiety that ran through Birkenhead residents in 2006 in response to a proposed rezoning of factory land for residential purposes. Over 500 submissions were sent to the North Shore City Council opposing these plans. What I found most interesting in these submissions, however, was that this large-scale apprehension did not appear to stem from a fear of losing the actual Chelsea Sugar brand, but instead from a fear of the brand's relocation to a new site. This prompted me to wonder, if Chelsea Sugar, the actual physical output created by the factory, was not at risk, why were we working so hard to protect the mere building in which it began? To answer this question, I decided to delve deeper into three lesser explored areas of Chelsea's history. This allowed me to better understand some of the reasons why many people hold these buildings dear to their hearts. So the first area I explored was Chelsea's influence on the early development of Birkenhead. Until the mid to late 19th century, much of the land which we now know as Birkenhead remained largely uninhabited by Maori and Pākehā alike. Te Kawarau Aumaki, the iwi that whakapapa to the land, chose to settle at nearby locations better suited for kumara growing and pā building, instead of in Birkenhead. In the mid-19th century, a handful of Pākehā settlers did set up orchards in the area. However, the region was far from establishing itself as a community with its own sense of identity. There was not yet any village centre, church, school, or public wharf. Indeed, a New Zealand Herald article has since noted how, in the 1860s, Northcote and Birkenhead were neglected areas, largely covered with bush and scrub. Things changed in the 1880s, when Chelsea ushered in families and money. In 1883, 150 workers migrated to the region to build the factory, living in tents on refinery land. At least 100 of these workers later set up more permanent accommodation and stayed on to run the factory. By 1886, the population had increased fivefold to over 500 people. And 2 years later, in 1888, the Birkenhead Borough Council came into existence. After this, Chelsea quickly became the mainstay of Birkenhead's identity. The sugar company entered into a partnership with the Birkenhead Borough Council for the Sugar Works ash to be used to pave Birkenhead's main roads. The company also introduced the Housing Advances for Wage Earners scheme, a housing loan scheme which financed over 130 homes in Birkenhead between 1910 and 1926. The Chelsea whistle became a defining feature of Birkenhead life, acting as both a town clock for the residents and a call to volunteer firefighters when there was a fire. However, the most prominent impact Chelsea had on Birkenhead's sense of identity was undoubtedly through the company-sponsored Chelsea picnics, held annually on what would otherwise have been a normal workday. Now, although company-sponsored, these picnics were attended by virtually the whole of Birkenhead, with one resident commenting on how they were one of the greatest things that's ever happened to Birkenhead. So although outsiders may see the factory as a mere building, it has been instrumental to the development of Birkenhead as a suburb with its own unique identity. Chelsea is also connected to wider movements within New Zealand's history. One of these was the labour movement, which was spearheaded by the introduction of the Industrial Conciliation and Arbitration Act of 1894, known colloquially as the IC&A. The goal of the IC&A was to ensure fair working conditions and put an end to strikes by encouraging employee-employer negotiations and requiring any disagreements to be settled by the arbitration court. This goal is ultimately demonstrated by the workings of the Birkenhead Sugar Worker Employees Union at Chelsea. When the Birkenhead Union first registered in 1901, neither working conditions nor industrial relations were first rate. Employees worked a massive 54-hour week in sweltering conditions, with air inside the factory often reaching 40 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, the company largely turned a blind eye to the workings of the union, refusing to acknowledge the externally sourced union secretary, Mr. Arthur Rosser, who's pictured here, and prohibiting the union from meeting on Chelsea grounds. In light of these circumstances, the union capitalized on the mechanisms of compulsory arbitration. On January 20th, 1902, the union took a dispute to court, asking for a 48-hour week and an increase in wages. Now, the court refused to raise wages, but it did grant a shorter week. It also granted the union a preference clause, which would require the company to employ union members in preference to non-union members with the same skill set, who may be willing to accept lower pay or longer hours. The relative success of the union was short-lived. In July 1911, the union's registration lapsed, and for the next 9 years, there would be no union to represent workers at Chelsea. In 1920, the union rebanded, but unlike its predecessor, it got off to a rocky start, organising the only major strike in the history of the Chelsea Sugar Works. On August 14th, 1920, workers walked off the job after the company refused to submit to a 44-hour week. The strike lasted 37 days, with the workers only returning on September 20th, when the arbitration court commenced an early setting and granted the union's wishes. Now, although the workers gained their shorter week, the strike's detrimental effects are indicative of the reasons for introducing compulsory arbitration in the first place. The strike cost the company 5 weeks' worth of revenue. Sugar shortages forced retailers to resort to strict rationing, and some manufacturers in the confectionery, jam, and biscuit industries temporarily closed their doors. On September 21st, 1920, the New Zealand Herald published a scathing attack on the strikers under the headline, "The Strike Discredited." The author did not hold back reprimanding the men responsible, labelling the strike futile, folly, and an unwarrantable attack upon the community. Accordingly, the 1920 strike would prove to be the first and last major strike in the history of Chelsea. In ensuing years, the union returned to the ICNA to settle disputes. Concurrently, union records suggest that industrial relations slowly but surely improved. In a correspondence between the union and the company in 1928, the union noted how it can now be truthfully said that our members feel that the relationship with their employers was never better. A letter from the union to the company in 1934 echoed this sentiment, referencing the goodwill that exists between the company and its employees. So clearly, the history of Chelsea Sugar Factory and its associated union is not an isolated one. Instead, it is one which provides us insight into broader events and movements. To lose the buildings would be to lose a sense of a space in which many aspects of the labour movement played out. My final topic involved exploring the human face of the factory, focusing on the interwar period when Chelsea was at its peak employment numbers. I looked to ask questions such as, who was the Chelsea sugar worker? How did they experience working at Chelsea? And what did they do in their free time? To do so, I was very lucky to access a collection of oral interviews with retired sugar workers. Now, most workers lived in or near Birkenhead. The factory was the only major source of employment around, making it an attractive place to work, despite the tough manual labour. As sugar worker Charlie Castleton noted, there were no fares, and there was no hassle with ferry boats or buses or anything like that. Workers mostly walked to work along a path known as the Telephone Road. This pathway is still present and signposted at the estate today. Entire families also often ended up working at Chelsea. Ernie France, who is pictured here, got a job at the refinery through his uncle when he was 12 and worked there for an astounding 51 years. During this time, Ernie worked alongside his uncle, cousin, and father, while his mother used to help with the refinery's washing. His wife, Jean, who is pictured here years later, worked as a cook at the Chelsea dining hall. A worker's overall experience at Chelsea naturally depended upon the department they worked in. However, workers undoubtedly agreed that working in the wash house was the worst job. This task involved supervising the filtering of mud and other debris out of the liquid sugar. The actual filtering was done in tanks using filter bags, but workers used to enter the tanks and stand in 3 feet of grimy water just to clear the bags out. The dirtiness of the job meant many workers carried out the task practically naked, with just a piece of cloth tied around their waist. Interestingly, most workers appeared content with their job, regardless of the tough conditions of employment. Perhaps contributing to this sense of contentment was the remarkable feeling of community created by involvement in social clubs and outings. On top of the highly anticipated annual picnic, there were several sports teams. The head chemists, for example, put together a Chelsea cricket team, which used to play competitions at Victoria Park. Meanwhile, many workers spoke fondly of their times at the Old Foresters' Hole in Birkenhead. Twice a week, on Wednesdays and Saturdays, a Chelsea bricklayer named Mr. Hannigan used to play the piano at the hole for silent movies. On Sundays, the municipal brass band, largely made up of sugar workers, would perform. Now, as you can tell, the interviews were riveting. But as I began listening, I realized that the accounts of these 10 workers could in no way encapsulate a universal experience of working at the factory. For one, there exist no interviews with either women or non-Pākehā employees, despite hints that these individuals worked at the factory. Therefore, the information you have just heard about these workers should in no means be taken as a comprehensive recount of how all workers enjoyed their time at Chelsea. Instead, I hope it merely invites you to reflect on the fact that the factory was, and remains to be, very much a human space. That is, for 138 years, it has been a place of work and leisure for thousands of workers who built their lives and identities around their jobs. So to quickly wrap up, I hope that this broad examination of some of Chelsea's less well-known history has helped you gain a better idea of why it was so important to Birkenhead residents that the factory not be relocated. For in its place at Birkenhead, this space has ties to personal, local, and national history.